November 1943, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The request seemed absurd. German prisoners asking for violins, cellos, and sheet music. Commander James Patterson stared at the man standing before his desk, a thin prisoner with intelligent eyes and calloused fingers that wouldn't stop moving, as if remembering something his hands once knew. The American commander's decision would create something so beautiful that local civilians would beg to attend the concerts, standing in line for hours just to hear enemy soldiers play. But that moment was still weeks away. First, these men had to survive becoming prisoners. June 1943. The North African desert stretched endlessly in every direction, shimmering with heat that made the horizon dance. Klaus Hermann hadn't eaten in 2 days. His unit had been cut off during the Allied advance through Tunisia, scattered across the rocky terrain like seeds thrown into barren soil. They'd fired their last rounds that morning. By afternoon, British tanks appeared on the ridge. The surrender happened quickly. Hands up, weapons down. The fear in Klaus's chest was something solid, something he could taste. He'd heard stories about what happened to prisoners. Executions, torture, labor camps where men worked until they died. He was 34 years old. He'd taught music to children in Leipzig before the war. He'd never wanted to be a soldier. The British soldiers were businesslike, almost bored. They searched the Germans for weapons, gave them water, pointed them toward a collection point where hundreds of other prisoners sat in the sand, guarded by men with rifles. Klaus found a spot and sat down. Around him, men whispered in German. Speculation, fear. Some prayed. Others stared at nothing. That night they were loaded onto trucks, then trains, then ships. The Mediterranean crossing took 3 days. Klaus spent most of it below deck in a converted cargo hold, pressed against 200 other men in a space designed for half that number. The air was thick and hot. Men vomited from seasickness. Some cried. Others sang quietly old folk songs from Bavaria, from Prussia, from wherever home used to be. Klaus didn't sing. He closed his eyes and remembered his classroom in Leipzig. The afternoon light coming through tall windows. 15 children with violins, their faces scrunched in concentration as they worked through a simple piece by Mozart. The sound wasn't always beautiful, beginners rarely are, but there was something pure in their effort. He'd spent 6 years teaching them. Then the war came and turned teachers into soldiers. At Gibraltar, they transferred to a larger ship, American now. The treatment improved, slightly more space, better food, fewer men crammed into each hold. Rumors spread through the prisoners like fever. They were going to America, to camps in the middle of the country. Some said Texas, others said somewhere called Tennessee. A few men had heard of New York, but nobody knew what Tennessee was. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. Klaus counted the days by scratching marks into the wooden wall beside his bunk. 14 lines. 14 days of endless ocean. The constant motion of the ship. The uncertainty that grew heavier with each sunrise. What would Americans do with German prisoners? Germany and America had been enemies for 2 years now. American boys were dying in Europe. Would their fathers and brothers want revenge? On the 15th day, someone shouted that they could see land. Klaus climbed up on deck with dozens of others, blinking in the bright sunlight. There, on the horizon, was America. The shore looked green and impossibly vast. As they drew closer, Klaus could see buildings that seemed untouched by war. No rubble, no bombed-out shells, just structures standing complete and whole. It looked like a photograph from before the war, from a time when cities weren't destroyed and children still had music lessons. They docked somewhere in Virginia. The processing took hours. American soldiers moved them through a series of stations, medical examinations, delousing, documentation, photographs. Klaus stood in line after line, answering questions to interpreters, getting poked and prodded by doctors who seemed more concerned with typhus and tuberculosis than with the fact that he was the enemy. The medical exam surprised him most. The American doctor was thorough, professional. He checked Klaus's teeth, his eyes, listened to his chest, examined the old shrapnel scar on his left shoulder from Sicily. The doctor made notes on a clipboard, then moved to the next prisoner. No brutality, no contempt, just efficiency. That night they were fed. Real food, not much, but hot soup with actual meat in it. Bread that wasn't moldy, coffee that tasted like coffee instead of acorns. Klaus ate slowly, savoring each bite. Around him, men whispered in amazement. This was not what they'd expected. This was not the treatment of enemies who were hated. The train ride to Tennessee took 2 days. They traveled in passenger cars this time, not cattle cars. Through the windows, Klaus watched America pass by. Forests thick with trees. Rivers wide and clean. Small towns that looked prosperous. Farms with red barns and organized fields. Everything seemed abundant in a way that Germany hadn't been for years. Even before the war, Leipzig had felt crowded, pressed in on itself. This country sprawled. A prisoner named Friedrich sat next to Klaus. He'd been an accountant in Munich before the war. Young, maybe 26, with glasses he'd somehow managed not to lose during capture. Friedrich stared out the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. "Look at those farms," Friedrich whispered. "No bomb craters. No burned fields. It's like the war doesn't exist here." Klaus nodded. Friedrich was right. America was vast and untouched. The war was something happening elsewhere, something that hadn't reached these green fields and quiet towns. For the people living here, the war was news on the radio, not ruins in their streets. They arrived at Camp Forest on a Tuesday afternoon. The camp sprawled across what had once been farmland near a town called Tullahoma. Guard towers marked the perimeter. Barbed wire stretched between posts. Rows of wooden barracks stretched toward the tree line. It looked like a military base, which it had been before they converted part of it for prisoners. American soldiers processed them again. More documentation. More photographs. They were issued uniforms, not American ones, but simple work clothes with PW stenciled on the back in white paint. Prisoner of war. Klaus pulled on the shirt and felt the weight of what he'd become settle on his shoulders. The barracks were basic but solid. Wooden frame construction with rows of metal bunks, 2 men to a bunk, 1 on top, 1 below. A pot-bellied stove sat at each end for heat. The windows had screens but no glass. In summer it would be hot. In winter it would be cold. But it was shelter, and after weeks on ships and trains, that was enough. Klaus was assigned bunk 23 lower. His bunkmate was an older man named Werner, who'd been a farmer near Hamburg. Werner had kind eyes and rough hands and didn't talk much. That suited Klaus fine. He wasn't ready for conversation yet, that first night. Lying on his bunk with a thin blanket pulled up to his chin, Klaus stared at the wooden ceiling and tried to understand what had happened to his life. 2 months ago, he'd been a soldier in Africa. Now he was a prisoner in Tennessee. Germany was an ocean away. Leipzig was an ocean away. Everything he'd known, his apartment near the conservatory. His students, the cafe, where he'd drunk coffee every morning, all of it existed in a world he might never see again. The homesickness came in. Waves, physical, heavy. Klaus closed his eyes and tried to remember the last piece he'd played. It had been in early 1942, before his conscription. A small recital at the conservatory. He'd performed Schumann's Violin Sonata, No. 1. The memory of it was vivid, his fingers on the strings, the weight of the bow, the way the music filled the concert hall. That felt like a different lifetime now. That felt like something that had happened to someone else. The days at Camp Forest developed a rhythm. Morning roll call at 7. Breakfast at 8, oatmeal, usually sometimes eggs, coffee that was real. Then work assignments. The Geneva Convention said prisoners could be put to work, so they were. Some men went to nearby farms to help with harvest. Others worked in the camp itself, kitchen duty, maintenance, laundry. Klaus was assigned to the camp garden, helping grow vegetables for the mess hall. The work was simple but exhausting. Digging, planting, weeding. His hands, which had been trained for precision on violin strings, blistered and calloused. But he didn't mind. The work kept his mind occupied. The garden was peaceful. And the American guards who supervised were generally decent, not friendly exactly, but not cruel either. They followed the rules. They didn't beat prisoners or humiliate them for sport. The biggest challenge was the boredom. After work ended at 5, there were hours before lights out at 10. Some men played cards. Others wrote letters home, though nobody knew if the letters ever arrived. A few formed study groups to learn English from the guards. But mostly men sat and smoked and talked and tried not to think too much about how long the war might last. Klaus spent those evening hours remembering music. He would lie on his bunk with his eyes closed and work through pieces in his mind. Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, Mozart's Violin Concerto, No. 5, Bach's Chaconne. His fingers would move slightly, pressing invisible strings, drawing invisible bows. Werner noticed once and asked what he was doing. "I was a music teacher," Klaus said quietly. "Before." Werner nodded. "What did you teach?" "Violin, piano sometimes." "Mostly children. Must have been nice work." "It was." Klaus paused. "It was everything." After that, Werner would sometimes ask Klaus about music during their evening conversations. What pieces did he love most? What was it like to teach? Klaus would answer, and for a few minutes, the barracks would fade and he'd be back in Leipzig. Back in his classroom with the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. By October, Klaus had been at Camp Forest for 4 months. The rhythm of camp life had become routine. Garden work, meals, evening hours of quiet conversation. The war continued somewhere else. News filtered in through guards. Through German-language newspapers the camp commander allowed them to receive. Italy had surrendered. The Allies were bombing German cities. But it all felt distant, like something happening in another world. One evening in late October, Klaus was lying on his bunk working through Beethoven's 6th Symphony in his mind when he heard it. Music. Actual music. Coming from somewhere outside the barracks. He sat up quickly, listening. Yes, there it was. A phonograph or radio playing from the guards' recreation building across the yard. The sound was faint but clear. Swing music. American jazz. The kind of music the Nazis had banned in Germany. Klaus had always secretly loved it. Friedrich appeared next to his bunk. "You hear that?" Klaus nodded. "Makes you realize how quiet it's been, doesn't it?" Friedrich said softly. 4 months without music. Friedrich was right. Klaus hadn't realized how much silence had accumulated until sound broke it. The absence of music had become so normal that he'd stopped noticing it was missing. But now, hearing even faint swing music through the barracks walls, he felt something shift in his chest. The next morning, during garden duty, Klaus couldn't stop thinking about it. Music, not just memory, but actual sound. Notes in the air, rhythm, melody, harmony, the things that made life more than just survival. That night he mentioned it to Werner. "What if we asked for instruments?" Klaus said quietly. Werner looked at him like he'd suggested they ask for a flying machine. They'd never allow it. Why not? The Geneva Convention says prisoners should be allowed recreation. Cards are recreation. Why not music? Because we're Germans. Because their sons are dying fighting our army. Because it would be absurd. Klaus nodded. Werner was probably right. It was absurd. But the thought wouldn't leave him alone. Over the next few days, he asked other prisoners, casually, carefully, about their backgrounds. And slowly, a picture emerged. Friedrich had studied piano before becoming an accountant. Werner had played accordion at village festivals. A prisoner named Otto had been a cellist with the Hamburg Philharmonic before the war. Another man, Hans, had played viola, musicians everywhere. Hidden among the prisoners like seeds waiting for water, Klaus lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The idea had lodged itself in his mind and wouldn't dislodge. What if they asked? What if, somehow, the Americans said yes? What if he could hold a violin again? What if they could make music together? It was impossible. It was absurd. But Klaus had been a soldier in Africa, and now he was a prisoner in Tennessee, and impossible things kept happening. Maybe one more impossible thing might happen too. November arrived. The air turned cold. Klaus had been at Camp Forest for 5 months. 5 months without teaching. 5 months without his violin. 5 months of silence that felt like suffocation. The decision crystallized on a Tuesday evening. Klaus was walking back from the mess hall when he heard it again, music from the guards building. This time it was classical. He stopped, listening. Brahms, Symphony No. 1. The American guards were listening to Brahms. Something broke open inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but hunger, need. The kind of desperate need that makes impossible requests seem reasonable. He found Werner in the barracks. "I'm going to ask." Werner looked up from the letter he was writing. "Ask what?" "For instruments. For permission to form an orchestra." "Klaus, I have to try. I have to ask. Maybe they'll say no, but I have to try." Werner studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then ask." Klaus spent the next 2 days gathering information. He learned that Commander Patterson held office hours every Thursday afternoon. Prisoners could request meetings through the guards for grievances or special requests. Klaus filled out the form, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote, "Request permission to speak with Commander regarding recreational activities." The form disappeared into camp bureaucracy. Klaus waited. Days passed. Then, on a Monday morning, a guard approached him during garden duty. "Hermann? Commander wants to see you Thursday at 2. Klaus's heart hammered. "Thank you." Thursday arrived. At 2 o'clock, Klaus stood outside Commander Patterson's office, his hands sweating despite the November cold. A guard gestured him inside. The office was small but tidy. An American flag stood in one corner. A desk covered with papers dominated the center. Behind it sat Commander James Patterson, maybe 45 years old. Graying hair, tired eyes, the look of a man who'd been given a job he hadn't asked for. Patterson gestured to a chair. "Sit. You speak English?" "Some," Klaus said carefully. His English was rough but functional. "Your request form said you want to discuss recreation. What specifically?" Klaus took a breath. This was the moment. The impossible request. "Music, sir. I was a music teacher before the war. Many prisoners here have musical training. We would like permission to have instruments. To form an orchestra." Patterson stared at him. The silence stretched. Klaus could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind him. Finally, Patterson spoke. "You want me to give musical instruments to German prisoners?" "Yes, sir. While American boys are dying overseas fighting your army." "Yes, sir." Klaus met his eyes. The Geneva Convention allows recreational activities. Music is recreation. It would be good for morale. Good for the camp. Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Klaus with an expression that was impossible to read. Klaus waited, his heart hammering, his impossible request hanging in the air between them. Patterson didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his desk, at the stack of reports and requisition forms, and disciplinary notices that made up his days. Klaus remained silent, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether music returned to his life or remained a memory. I grew up in Ohio, Patterson said finally, his voice quiet. Small town called Marietta. My father worked at a furniture factory. Made decent money, but we weren't rich. Every Saturday night, people would gather at the Grange Hall for dances. My father played fiddle. Klaus wasn't sure where this was going. So he just listened. He wasn't a professional or anything. Self-taught. But he could make that fiddle sing. I remember being maybe 8 years old, watching him play, watching people dance. My mother said music was the thing that made us more than just animals working and eating and sleeping. She said it made us human. Patterson looked up, met Klaus's eyes. You know how many letters I get from townspeople? How many complaints? They hear there's Germans here, and they want to know why we're not working you harder, feeding you less, making you suffer. Some of them lost sons, lost brothers. They want revenge, not Geneva Conventions. I understand, sir. Do you? Patterson's voice hardened slightly. Because if I give you instruments, if I let you form an orchestra, the newspaper will hear about it. People will be angry. They'll say I'm coddling the enemy while their boys die in Europe. Klaus nodded slowly. Then the answer is no. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Klaus could hear the sounds of the campmen talking, boots on gravel, the distant clang of mess hall preparations beginning. I didn't say no, Patterson said finally. I said people will be angry. There's a difference. He leaned forward. You were a teacher? Yes, sir. Leipzig Conservatory. I taught violin and piano to children. How many prisoners here have musical training? I have found at least 15 with significant experience. One man was a professional cellist. Another studied piano at university. Others played in church orchestras, military bands, village ensembles. Patterson made a note on a piece of paper. What would you need? Specifically. Klaus felt his heart accelerate. This wasn't a no. This wasn't even a maybe. This was Patterson asking for details. Violins, violas, cellos, perhaps a piano, though I know that is much to ask. Sheet music. The Geneva Convention allows. I know what the convention allows. Patterson cut him off, but not unkindly. Let me be clear, Herman. I'm not promising anything, but I'll look into what's possible. That's a big if I can find instruments, there will be conditions. Strict conditions. Practice times will be limited. Performances, if any, will be supervised. One disciplinary incident from any orchestra member, and the whole thing ends. Understood? Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. And Herman? This conversation doesn't leave this office. You don't tell the other prisoners I'm considering it. You don't build up hopes that might get crushed. Clear? Yes, sir. Patterson waved a hand. Dismissed. Klaus stood, turned toward the door, then paused. Sir, may I ask why? Why are you considering this? Patterson looked at him for a long moment. Because my mother was right. Music makes us human. And if we stop treating you like humans, even though you're prisoners, even though we're enemies, then maybe we become something less than human too. He picked up a pen. Now get out. I have work to do. Klaus walked back to the barracks in a daze. Werner was sitting on his bunk, mending a shirt. Well? Werner asked. Klaus shook his head. He said maybe. That's better than no. He said not to tell anyone. Not to build up hopes. Werner smiled slightly. Then we won't tell anyone. We'll just hope quietly. The waiting was excruciating. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. Klaus worked in the garden, ate his meals, lay on his bunk in the evenings trying not to think about it. But every time he heard footsteps approaching, every time a guard called someone's name, his heart would jump. Maybe this was it. Maybe Patterson had an answer. By early December, Klaus had convinced himself it was never going to happen. Patterson had looked into it and discovered it was impossible. Or the townspeople had protested. Or the army had regulations that prevented it. The reasons didn't matter. The answer was no, even if it hadn't been spoken aloud yet. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Klaus was in the garden digging up the last of the season's turnips when a guard approached. "Hermann, Commander wants you, now." Klaus dropped his shovel and followed the guard across the compound. His hands were dirty, his work clothes covered in mud. He hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared anything to say. Patterson's office looked the same as before. But this time there was a different energy in the air, something charged, anticipatory. "Sit," Patterson said. Klaus sat. Patterson pulled out a folder, opened it. "I've been making inquiries. Turns out there's a music store in Chattanooga. Owner's name is Robert Chun. His family came from China 30 years ago. He knows what it's like to be foreign in a country at war." I explained the situation. "He's willing to help." Klaus's throat tightened. "Sir? I'm authorizing the purchase of instruments for recreational use by prisoners at this camp. Mr. Chun is assembling what he can. Won't be a full orchestra, his inventory is limited, but it's a start. 12 violins, 4 cellos, 2 violas, sheet music. He's also donating an old upright piano his shop has been storing." Klaus couldn't speak. The words wouldn't form. Patterson continued, his tone businesslike. "The conditions I mentioned before all stand. Practice times will be limited to evenings, 6 to 8 p.m., 3 days a week. You'll use the recreation hall. Instruments remain in American custody. They'll be locked up when not in use. Any damage, any misuse, anything that makes me regret this decision, and it all ends. Choose your orchestra members carefully. I'm holding you personally responsible for their conduct." "Yes, sir." Klaus's voice came out rough. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This might blow up in both our faces." Patterson closed the folder. "Instruments should arrive next week. In the meantime, make a list of the prisoners you want in your orchestra. Submit it to me for approval. Names and their musical backgrounds." Klaus nodded, not trusting himself to speak further.